morning, everyone. Well, I hope that you have been enjoying our series in the book of Ecclesiastes. And if you are new to us, or if you're new to the book of Ecclesiastes, just want to say a couple things about it, because it is easy to misunderstand or get off track in our read. Certainly in our first reading of Ecclesiastes, we almost read the book and think, this doesn't belong. It doesn't fit here. In chapter 1, verse 2, if you have the NIV, here's what it says. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Over and over and over again. This does not sound like spiritual Christian writing, meaningless. It almost sounds nihilistic. But what we have to remember, that the scope of Ecclesiastes is life where? Under the sun. He is talking about man's attempt to find life in the seen world, life under the sun. And as we have discovered, when that is our target, when that is our aim, to try to make sense of a world without looking at the one that made the world, it is empty, it is meaningless, it is vanity, and it is perpetual. It continues. We just cannot, it is a chasing after the wind. And for the next 4 weeks, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a series of strategies that man will instinctively employ to try to make sense of this world in the midst of the chaos that we all feel and experience. And there's a couple of things that these strategies have in common. Number one is that they're instinctive. They are not things that we've been taught to pursue. They are things that kind of bubble up in the surface, in our hearts. They present themselves as a viable solution to this subconscious perception of hevel, of vanity, of meaninglessness. That is the first thing that they all share in common. And the second thing that they all share in common is that they don't work. They are failed strategies. Or perhaps it would be better to say they are limited in their ability. It's not that they're necessarily all bad. The things that we're going to be looking at are wisdom, work, wealth, and pleasure. And each of those things is not inherently bad unless and until we look to them to provide for us something that they were never intended to provide and that they don't have the capacity to provide. And so we're going to be looking at each of these strategies. We're going to take one at a time, and we decided we would kind of teach them according to, what we had the most experience with. So this week I'll be talking about wisdom, and next week Quig will be talking about pleasure. So it's kind of a joke, but Quig will be talking about pleasure next week. But this week we're going to talk about wisdom. And so if you have your Bible, open to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 12. And here's what we read. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Let's stop there for a second. Let me tell you why I think this is important. Now, most commentators, and I tend to agree, though there is some debate, most commentators believe that this is Solomon. This is King Solomon writing. At least it is someone who is using source material of King Solomon and writing on his behalf. He says, I am the king in Israel, in Jerusalem, over Israel, over all Israel. And here's why it's important to note who it is that's writing. Because he has credibility to talk about the things that he's about to talk about. Solomon was throughout the world known as the wisest person to ever live and the wealthiest person to ever live. And therefore, if there was ever a person who was going to be able to find wisdom and knowledge, it was him. He had the resources to do it, not only the financial resources, but he had the intellectual capacity to do it. He had the determination to do it. In fact, did you know Solomon had over 700 wives? Which some of us might say, that's not terribly wise. But each of these would have likely been a strategic alliance that would have expanded his influence and would have given him an even greater global perspective than a lot of his contemporaries would have had. He was a powerful man. He was a man of influence. He was a man of deep intellect. In fact, there's a story in 1 Kings 10, where there's a woman, this Gentile queen, and she comes to Solomon because she had heard about his wisdom. She had heard about how brilliant he was, and she came to test him. And she showed up there and asked him questions, and he answered every question. It says every question was easy for him. And she left there saying, I'm more impressed than even the rumors. The reality had exceeded what she even thought. This was a guy, like if anybody's going to find it, it's going to be Solomon. And here's what Solomon is committed to do. In verse 13, he says, I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It says he devoted himself. The literal there is he applied his heart. He set his heart on something. The heart is talking about his inner life. This was not something that he was just doing for show. He was not just going through the motions. There was a deep and inner longing to discover something. And here's what he was going to do. It says he was going to seek and to search. There's two different verbs. That word to seek, it means to observe something that's in front of you, to study it. It was going to be something that he looked intently into, the things that he already knew. But then that word to search is the same word that is used in Numbers when Moses sends out spies to investigate the land of Canaan. His search was going to be deep, but it was going to be wide. If there was meaning that could be gained through the faculties of his mind, he was going to find it. He was committed. But he is going to make 3 quick conclusions about this search. Listen to the first one. This is the end of verse 13. He says, what a heavy burden God has laid on men. If you have the ESV, I think it gets it even better. It says it's an unhappy business given by God to men to be busy with. Solomon's first observation or conclusion here is this: that this seeking and searching that at first looks like a conscious commitment that he makes, it's actually an involuntary response of every human heart. Did you hear what he said? It is a burden that has been given to men, and it's an unhappy one. It's an unhappy task that he applies himself to do, and he cannot help it. He would say it again in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11. In fact, he uses that exact same phrase. He says, I have seen the burden that God has laid on men. And then here's the burden. He has set eternity in their hearts. But he cannot understand what has happened from the beginning until now. In other words, God has placed inside every single human heart this divine longing, but he has left them in a world for which there is no fulfillment of that longing. It is perpetual frustration, and it is assigned or appointed to men by God. That is his first conclusion. His second conclusion is the next verse. He says in verse 14, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. He looked at everything. He tried everything. And as he will tell us in the rest of the book, he tried lots of things. He said, I've seen everything done under the sun. And here's his second conclusion. All of them are meaningless. That word, of course, is the Hebrew word hevel. The ESV interprets it vanity. Meaningless is actually not a very good interpretation of the word. A better one, Quigg said it last week, is vapor or smoke. It's not that there's no meaning. It's that he knows there's meaning, and he just can't seem to grasp it. See, smoke, it looks like it's a solid, but as soon as you try to grab it, it slips through your fingers. In fact, the sentence that follows describes what he means by vanity when he says, it is a chasing after the wind. It is ambition after something that is unattainable. And it's striving. And it never ends, it never stops, and it's never satisfied. That's his second conclusion. And his third conclusion is this, and he's going to tell us why it's so frustrating. And here's what he says, verse 15. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. What does he mean? What is twisted could be interpreted what is crooked. And often the Bible uses this word to describe evil, immorality in the world. What Solomon, I think, is saying here is that there are things in the world that no matter how hard I look, no matter how much I study, I will never be able to explain why evil exists in the heart of man. Do you know, for all the advancement in technology, for all of the things that we have discovered throughout the history of the world in education, our universities can teach lots of things. You know what they can't teach? Why there is evil and why we cannot solve it. Why is there endless war and poverty and greed and selfishness? There is no explanation for crooked things in our world. They cannot be made straight. What he's saying here is this: there are some things that I see that I cannot explain. And so it leads to frustration. But there's a second thing that he says. He says, what is lacking cannot be counted. What does he mean by that? He means there are some missing pieces to the puzzle. It's not just that there's things that I see that I can't explain. There are things that I know that should be there that I can't see. He said there's no explanation for the world's anomalies. And then there are things that we just instinctively know that we can't see. He said there are unanswered questions, and there always will be. If anybody was going to find it, Solomon was going to find it, and he didn't. He failed. And then in verse 16, we're essentially going to see a repeat of what just happened. If you noticed, in verse 13 and 14, Solomon is going to make a statement about the vanity of pursuing wisdom and knowledge under the sun. And then in verse 15, he gives us a proverb. It's a saying to support what he said in verses 13 and 14. But now, in verse 16 and 17, he's going to do the exact same thing. He's going to make a statement about the vanity of pursuing wisdom and knowledge under the sun. And in verse 18, he's going to give us another proverb or a saying that supports that claim. Listen to what he says. It's a little different in verse 16. He says, I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly, but I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. In verse 13, he was at the beginning of his journey. Wisdom and knowledge were in front of him. Here in verse 16 and 17, he's looking in the rear view. He is looking at the sum total or the accumulation of all the wisdom and knowledge over a life spent pursuing it. And he reflects on what he has accumulated. And he says this, he says, look, I'm smarter than everyone. And he was, as we've already referenced. And perhaps what he has in mind here is maybe, even though I didn't get all my questions answered, maybe the fact that I'm smarter than everybody will satisfy me. The status of my knowledge and wisdom. But he says this too. This too is meaningless. It is a chasing after the wind. And then listen to this proverb or saying that's even more dark and depressing than the first. He says, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Isn't that depressing? With much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. What does he mean by this? I'd like to offer three possibilities. Number one, with much knowledge comes much grief. There is a sense that the more we know, the more we realize that we don't know. The more we discover, the more we realize that there's so much more to discover. There's just this endless pursuit, and we recognize we're never going to get there. But in a deeper sense, as I mentioned, in verse 13, he was at the beginning of his pursuit. Knowledge was in front of him. And here, in verse 16, he's already obtained it. and he's disillusioned. You see, in verse 13, there's the anticipation. There is this kind of hope that the gaining of knowledge would satisfy something within. And in verse 16 and 17, there's the disillusionment that he got it and it didn't work. You know, there's a Dutch study that is often cited that shows that our anticipation of a thing is actually more fulfilling than getting the thing itself. Did you know this? Have you experienced this? I know I have. Especially when that thing is a letdown. It's a disappointment. And that's what he is tasting here. But then I'd like to offer a third possibility, one that I'm certain Solomon did not have in mind because he could not possibly have fathomed the world that you and I live in today. What age do you and I live in? It is the information age. In fact, there has never been a time in all of human history that a human being had as much access to information that you have in the palm of your hand. In fact, every single day from here until the day that you die, it will be a world record for the most information available to all humans. And tomorrow, the record will be broken again in perpetuity forever. With the dawn of artificial intelligence, this is just going to increase exponentially. And do you know what's fascinating? We are also a generation that is more depressed, more anxious, more empty, more lonely than ever before. There is an inverse correlation between accumulated knowledge and quality of life. Have you experienced this? Do you know there's actually a condition that people, that scientists, doctors have started to acknowledge, and it's called information overload? I'm going to read to you. I was going to read to you some statistics, but it's down there. Information overload. It's also known as infobesity, infoxity. There's a couple other things. Infoxication. But it's this idea that our brains, our finite minds, cannot process the amount of information that we are submitting into it. And it leads to anxiety. It leads to a lack of creativity. It leads to sleeplessness. It leads to an inability to make decision and just overall unhappiness. See, Solomon, I don't think he knew what he was saying, but when he says, as knowledge increases, so does grief, that is a scientific fact. Our brains just cannot contain all of the knowledge. I'll tell you one time that this bore itself out in my own life. Back in 2019, I stepped off a Young Life staff in pursuit of a new career as an entrepreneur, started a business. And I was learning so much. I was reading things constantly. I was listening to podcasts. And then I was learning in real time a business that I had never run before. I was falling down. I was having to solve problems. And my mind was endlessly going at all times. Do you know this experience? And my sweet wife, who every once in a while will say something to me that is so piercingly true that I never forget it. She looked at me one day and she said, Dave, even when you're here, you are not here. And I instantly knew that it was true because my finite mind was trying to hold on to more than it was capable of holding on to. We can't do it. We will not find the answers to life under the sun. How depressing. Let's close in prayer. I'm just kidding. That is not the end. It cannot be the end. See, Solomon knew more about wisdom than he was letting on here. But we have to remember that Solomon was writing about life under the sun. If he wasn't, it would be reasonable to conclude that God is cruel. It's not just that we don't have answers to our questions, it's that he ordained this struggle and he left us in a place that we weren't going to be able to find the answers. But see, Solomon knew that there was more to the story. He knew that there was more. See, God didn't leave us here in this world where there's no answers because he's cruel, but because he was pleased to allow us to be endlessly frustrated by our attempts to find life apart from him. See, what Solomon is talking about here is an attempt to find wisdom and knowledge apart from God, or maybe a better way to say it is to find wisdom and knowledge instead of God, and he's not the first one to try. Can you think of someone else that reached for wisdom and understanding and knowledge? When she saw that the fruit was pleasing to the eye and good for food and desirable for what? Wisdom and knowledge. She took and she ate. She did not like what she saw. This reaching for wisdom and knowledge apart from God has been on repeat throughout all of human history. In fact, the history of philosophy from the ancient times to the medieval times to the modern times, it is just Genesis 3:6 on repeat, and it always ends in despair. Because God is cruel? No. But because he was pleased to leave us in a place where things are crooked, where things are lacking and bent, so that we would recognize we cannot find it on our own. There's a singer-songwriter named David Wilcox that I started listening to when I was in high school. And the first song I ever heard him write and sing was a song called "That's What the Lonely Is For." It's a great song. But I just want to recite to you the chorus of this song that is profound. I'm not even sure at the time that he wrote this song he was a Christian. I think he is now. But listen to these words. He says, "When I get lonely, that's only a sign. Some room is empty. That room is there by design. If I feel hollow, that's just my proof that there's more for me to follow. That's what the lonely is for." See, Solomon knew that there was more to the story on gaining weight. There is no answer under the sun, but he knew that that's not all there was. He said a lot more about wisdom. In fact, can I tell you something that Jesus referenced? In Matthew chapter 11 and verse 19, he's responding to these accusations that people had about him, that he was a drunkard and a glutton, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, and he says this enigmatic thing at the end of Matthew 11 and verse 19. He says this, "Wisdom will be justified by her deeds." It's wisdom personified. Do you know a place in your Bible where wisdom is personified as a lady wisdom? It is Proverbs 8. And it's the same person who wrote Ecclesiastes. And I want you to hear what he had to say. Why would Jesus point to Proverbs 8? Listen. The Lord, this is wisdom speaking. "The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works before his deeds of old. I was appointed from eternity, from the beginning, before the world began. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundary so the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth." Then, skipping ahead, "Now then, my sons, listen to me. Whoever finds me finds life and receives favor. But whoever fails to find me harms himself." See, what Jesus was pointing to and what Solomon knew is that wisdom is not a thought or a philosophy to be discovered. It is a person who one day and who now has been revealed. And he, Jesus, is someone who, like us, seeks endlessly and searches endlessly. So you and I, our seeking and searching always ends in frustration because we are always looking under the sun and we are never looking to the sun. And that is where life is ultimately found. He is, 1 Corinthians 1:24, wisdom from God. In him, Colossians 3:2, are all the secret treasures of wisdom and knowledge. He is the one, Isaiah 45:2, who comes to make crooked things straight and to provide that which is lacking. He will turn our grief into joy and our sorrow into laughter. He is what the lonely is for. He is what you have been searching for. He is what I have been searching for. And we will not find it under the sun. And because he knew we would never look for him, he left heaven. In fact, Philippians 2 and verse 7, and I'll end with this. It says that he, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. But then it says this, he made himself nothing. The ESV says he emptied himself. It's a Greek word, kinoo. Do you know it, Harrison? And what it means, one of the translations of that word is to be in vain. He made himself vanity. He made himself nothing. That is to say, he identified with the hevel of our world so that we could know the wisdom of God. And as St. Augustine says, our hearts are restless until when? Until we find our rest in him. And we don't find rest because we have all the answers now to our questions, but because we have found the one who does. And we are at peace. This is what you were made for. Would you pray with me? Father, I pray that you would help us to surrender. God, that you would bring us to a place where we can say in our hearts, your ways are higher than our ways, your thoughts are higher than our thoughts. We can stop the search, the maddening, restless, endless pursuit of wisdom and knowledge apart from you, and we come to wisdom personified, to Jesus Christ, the one for whom our souls were made, where we find ultimate rest. Not life under the sun, but life in your Son. God, I pray that some might find it for the first time today. If you're here and you want someone to pray with you, we have these straight rails that people would love to pray with you, and these curved rails will be for you to pray. Would you stand as we worship together?
Worthy